softly spoken. Hello, 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 hi. Hello, hi. I am Spantopia Rose, but you can call me Span. How are you? How are you? How are you? I thought today I would read a Shelley Barber book to you. So the next one in the series I have chosen is called Rainbow Magic. Rainbow Magic, Story and Pictures by Shelley Barber. Rainbow Magic. By Shelley Barber. Let's see if we can get that in just a little bit closer. Alright. By Shelley Barber. Once upon a time, there was an old lady called Gran Tibbet. She lived in an old house on the edge of the forest with her granddaughter, Annie Tibbet, and little dog Bozo. Around the house was Gran Tibbet's pretty rose garden, and around the rose garden was a grassy meadow that went right to the edge of the dark fern forest. Early in the morning, the deer and their fawns would come out of the forest and eat the grass in the meadow. Sometimes Annie could get quite close to a fawn, but little dog Bozo would run out and bark at the big deer. One day they won't run away, Annie scolded, then you'll be sorry. But little dog Bozo only laughed. When the weather turned cold, Gran Tibbet's knee joints stiffened and her elbows creaked, and everything that could ache began to ache. Then Gran would sigh and sadly say, I'm getting old, and I'm good and ready for my heavenly reward. But who will take care of you when I've gone to glory? Yikes. Annie and little dog Bozo were not really worried because they thought Gran would go on being Gran forever. They built houses of dried fern fronds and made leaf boats and sailed them on the still water. A big fish lived in the pool, and if they kept very still, he rose to look at them. But Bozo always barked, and with a splash, the fish would be gone again. On showery days, Annie sometimes saw a rainbow. So close, she called to Gran, shall I run to see if I can find the fairy's crock of gold at the end of the rainbow? But Gran said, you keep away from rainbows, Annie. They are very funny things. You can get caught under rainbows and never come home again. One day, when Annie and little dog Bozo were playing in Fern Forest, it began to rain. They crept into a hollow tree. Soon the sun shone again, and suddenly a big, beautiful rainbow came curving out of the sky and touched the mossy ground in front of them. They stared in astonishment. Just inside the rainbow was a crock filled with gold. Oh, cried Annie. What a lovely present to take home to Gran. She forgot all about Gran Tibbet's warning, and she and little dog Bozo ran to pick up the crock of gold. But as they went under the rainbow, something very strange happened. They grew smaller and smaller and changed into two little fairy folk. Both Annie and little dog Bozo now had wings and were so small that the grass blades were as tall as to them as trees. Oh, Bozo, cried Annie, how will we find our way home to Gran to tell her what has happened to us? She sat down under a toadstool and began to cry. Little dog Bozo tried to fly with his new wings, but instead he fell down, head over paws into a violet bed. Annie couldn't help laughing. We won't be able to fly home till we've had some practice, she said. Come along, Bozo, we'll have to walk. The crock of gold, which had looked so big through the rainbow, was small now, so Annie put it into her lunch bag, and off they went. They walked and walked until they met a family of deer. To the two fairy folk, the deer were as big as mountains, the biggest deer in the whole world. Little dog Bozo ran out and barked at them as he had always done, but these deer didn't run away. The smallest fawn frightened Bozo, so he hid behind Annie. "We must go home another way," she said. They came to a deep, dark pool with a huge fish swimming in it. "Is that the fish we used to watch?" whispered Annie to Bozo. "He looks big enough to eat us now. How shall we get across?" Just then a frog came out from his moss-covered house under the bank and offered to ferry them across the water. "What a nice boat," Annie said to Bozo. "It reminds me of something. Why, I do believe it's one of the boats we made when we were playing here." Now we know what became of them. The frogs took them. When they reached the other bank, she thanked the frog and gave him a biscuit from her lunch bag. The sun went down, and the forest filled with shadows. Annie and little dog Bozo began to feel frightened. Suddenly a family of mice came scurrying along the path, scaring Bozo. But the mice were friendly and warned the two new fairy folk that the big wild cat was out hunting. "Hurry, he's coming," they said. "Follow us." So Annie and little dog Bozo went home with the mice for supper. They had grasshopper pie and toasted midges, and Annie broke up some biscuits to give the baby mice. Then they all went to sleep together, tucked up small and warm in a soft bed of thistledown. When the moon rose, the mice ran out to dance in the moonlight, but Annie and little dog Bozo did not wake until sunrise. The next morning, the two new fairy folk set off on their long walk home, but before long realized they were quite lost. The sun grew hotter and hotter, and the ground grew damper and damper. Annie was admiring the beautiful flowers all around them, and little dog Bozo was splashing through the pools and frisking ahead when, "Help, help, help," he screamed. He was caught fast in the sticky leaf of a sundew and simply couldn't pull free. Luckily, Mr. Prickles came rumbling and snuffling along. Annie was very frightened, but Mr. Prickles looked down at poor little dog Bozo and laughed. "Humph, humph." Then he rooted him out with his long nose and went off chuckling and snuffling along the track. "There are so many dangers when you're small," sighed Annie. "If only we knew how to fly." A blue bird flew down beside them, and Annie asked him, "Please, could you show us how to fly home?" The bird said he didn't know how to teach fairy folk to fly, but he said they could come and stay the night with his family. So Annie and little dog Bozo went home to the bluebird's nest and had tea. They had moth cakes and ant cookies and drank tea out of flower cups. Annie broke up the last of her biscuits and gave it to the baby birds. Then they all sat on a wild rose branch and sang songs till it was time for bed. The next day, the bluebird said he had found a wise old Mr. Longlegs, who knew almost everything about everything. He led Annie and Bozo to Mr. Longlegs, who looked at them thoughtfully when he'd heard their story. "I think you'd better meet the fairy king and queen and all the other fairy folk," he said. "Little folk just like yourselves lived in the ferny glade by the waterfall just down the path." Annie and Bozo felt so happy to know there were other little people just like themselves. They thanked the bluebird and the wise old bird and ran towards the waterfall which sparkled between the trees. But suddenly that wicked wildcat pounced on little dog Bozo and was about to eat him. When? "Stop that at once," a voice commanded. "Put down that fairy person." It was the Fairy King. The cat sulkily put down little dog Bozo and slunk away. Then the Fairy King led them to Fairy Court, where they met the Fairy Queen. In Ferny Glade were gathered all of those who had gone under rainbows at one time or another. The king explained that because Annie and Bozo had not listened to Grand Tippet's warning, they would now be fairy folk, forever and ever. Just like the others. Then all the fairies, elves, pixies, and funny things came forward to greet them. Annie and Bozo had flying lessons with a new friend, Funny Thing Beetle. Mrs. Rabbit taught them what was good to eat and what was not, and lots of other useful things, like where to find honey and how to make flower seed cookies. An old gnome showed the new fairy folk how to build a house in a tree, and Annie and little dog Bozo soon built a beautiful little home. Funny Thing Beetle failed his house-building test when his house fell down, so Annie and little dog Bozo let him share their home because they felt so sorry for him. At last, Annie asked the Fairy King if they could visit Grand Tippet. The King and Queen wanted to see Gran's rose garden, so all the court winged their way through the fern forest till they came to Grand Tippet's old house. Gran was sitting in the twilight, feeling very sad. She had given up all hope of ever seeing Annie and little dog Bozo again. Suddenly, she looked up and saw a tiny little Annie and a weeny little dog Bozo alight upon her veranda rail. Behind them, all the fairies fluttered down to picnic in her rose garden. "Look, Gran," cried Annie, "we're safe after all. But we have to be fairy folk forever and ever. We're well and happy, and we've brought a present for you, the crock of gold we found under the rainbow." So Annie and little dog Bozo and their friend Funny Thing Beetle lived with the fairy folk forever, but they often came to talk to Gran while the fairy court picnicked in her rose garden. Gran stopped worrying about who would look after Annie and little dog Bozo after she had gone to glory, because she knew that now they could look after themselves. And what about that crock of gold? Of course it was only a fairy-sized crock of gold, so Gran set it on her mantelpiece in a tiny glass case, just to prove that fairy folk really did live in the fern forest, and that there really was a crock of gold to be found under the rainbow. What a story. What a story. Did you enjoy that? It was a little bit different to what I remembered, if I'm being honest. I forgot all of the part about Grand Tippet going to glory and being worried, and about how it is fairies who have the crock of gold under the rainbow, not leprechauns. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that story and you are feeling nice and relaxed, nice and relaxed and sleepy. Good night, sleep well, good night, sleep well.